The moment I almost scrolled past this. I almost didn't make this video. That is not a hook. That is what actually happened. 3 months ago, someone who watches this channel sent me a message asking if I had looked into Gluco6. I had not. And based on the name alone, I filed it in the same mental category where I keep everything I am never going to cover. Alongside the detox teas, the fat burner capsules, and the dozen other blood sugar supplements that have been emailed to me over the past 2 years with identical promises and different labels. What made me stop was not the product. It was the pattern of who was asking. In the span of about 10 days, I received variations of the same question from people I would describe as skeptical by nature. Not people who buy things easily. People who read labels, who ask uncomfortable questions, who have been burned by supplements before and know it. The fact that this particular product kept appearing in their messages, not as a recommendation but as a question, made me pay a different kind of attention. So I started looking. Not with the intention of recommending it, with the intention of explaining as clearly as I could whether there was anything here worth the attention it was getting, or whether this was another well-marketed product riding the momentum of a category that has been over-promising since before most of the people watching this were born. What I found changed my answer. Not immediately and not completely, but enough to make this video necessary. That is what this is. Not a promotion, not a takedown. An investigation from someone who had every reason to dismiss it and found enough reasons not to. And who is going to show you exactly what those reasons were, so you can reach your own conclusion about whether any of them apply to your situation. The blood sugar trap America walked into. Before I talk about any specific product, you need to understand the environment that product exists in. Because without that context, nothing I am about to say will land the way it needs to. 100 million Americans are currently living with diabetes or prediabetes. That number has been climbing for 3 decades. And the standard response of the American healthcare system to that reality has been to treat it as a pharmaceutical problem with pharmaceutical solutions, which means a growing number of people are managing a chronic metabolic condition with drugs that carry significant side effects that require ongoing monitoring and that in many cases address the symptom rather than the mechanism driving it. The supplement industry stepped into that gap and made it worse. Because the supplement industry realized there was a category of people who were frightened, who were looking for alternatives, and who were willing to spend money on products that sounded credible. What followed was a decade of blood sugar supplements built around the same handful of ingredients, dressed up with different branding, making claims calibrated precisely to stay just inside the legal boundary, and producing, in aggregate, enough disappointment to make anyone reasonable skeptical of the entire category. That is the environment Gluco6 exists in. A market saturated with products that overpromised, underdelivered, and left the people who needed real help more cynical and more unprotected than before. Understanding that context matters because it explains why the bar for what counts as credible in this space is different from what it would be in a less exploited category. And it explains why the question I was asked, "Is there anything here worth the attention?" required a more careful answer than I initially thought. Why I don't trust supplements, and why that changed. Let me be direct about my starting position when I began looking at Gluco6. I do not trust the supplement industry. That is not cynicism. That is a conclusion I arrived at after years of watching how products in this category are developed, marketed, and sold. The regulatory environment creates a situation where a company can put together a formula, make structure and function claims that sound meaningful without requiring clinical proof, and bring a product to market in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost that a pharmaceutical company would require. The barrier to entry is low. The incentive to overpromise is high. The consumer's ability to verify the claims is limited. The specific concerns I had about Gluco6 before I looked closely at the formula were the concerns I have about most products in this space. The first was about whether the formula was doing anything meaningfully different from the generic blood sugar support blends I had seen before. Same ingredients, different label, different price point. The second was about bioavailability. An ingredient can be clinically validated in isolation and still deliver almost none of its documented effect in a commercial capsule if the delivery mechanism is not optimized. Most supplements in this category do not address this. They include the ingredient. They do not include the conditions under which that ingredient works. The third concern was about the claims. Not whether they crossed legal lines, but whether they were designed to create expectations the product could not realistically meet. Because an expectation that is not met becomes a disappointed customer. And a disappointed customer is not someone the research failed. It is someone the marketing failed. What changed my position on Gluco6 specifically was not a single discovery. It was a sequence of answers to those three concerns that held up better than I expected when I tested them against what the peer-reviewed literature actually says. I am going to walk you through each of those answers, not because you should take my word for it, but because if you are going to make a decision about this product, you deserve to see the reasoning and evaluate it yourself. I read every negative review, so you don't have to. The first thing I did after working through the formula was go looking for reasons not to recommend this. That is not a sentence most people in this space would say out loud, but it is exactly what I did. I went to every review aggregator I could find, every forum thread, every comment section where Gluco6 was mentioned. I was looking for the pattern that would tell me this product had the same problems as everything else in this category. What I found was more nuanced than I expected. The complaints exist. I am not going to pretend they don't. But when you read enough of them, something becomes clear that a surface-level look would miss. The overwhelming majority of negative reviews fall into one of three categories. The first is delivery-related. Shipping delays, packaging concerns, things that have nothing to do with what the product actually does. The second is expectation mismatch. People who expected dramatic changes within a few days of starting, which is not how the physiology of blood sugar regulation works, and which the product itself never promised. The third category is the most instructive. People who use the product inconsistently or stopped before the window that the research suggests is necessary to see a meaningful metabolic response. What I did not find, and I was looking specifically for this, was a cluster of reports indicating that the product caused harm, that the formula interacted dangerously with common medications, that people experienced adverse events at a rate that stood out from what you see in the broader supplement category. That pattern of absence matters. In a space where products routinely generate legitimate safety complaints, a consistent absence of safety-related criticism across thousands of reviews is data. It does not mean the product is perfect. It means the risk profile is not what the skeptical version of me assumed it would be. The complaints that did give me pause were the ones about results, or the perceived lack of them. But when I cross-reference those accounts with what the ingredient research actually supports, the disconnect was almost always in the timeline. Blood sugar regulation is not an acute response. It is a sustained metabolic process. And the people who reported seeing real changes were, almost without exception, the ones who gave it the full 60 days and tracked their numbers consistently enough to notice gradual shifts rather than overnight transformations. That is not a defense of the product. That is a description of what the data actually looked like when I read all of it rather than just the headline reviews. The honest version of the complaint landscape here is that Gluco6 has real customers who are genuinely disappointed. And that when you look closely at why, the product's formula is almost never the reason. That changes the picture. It does not change it completely, but it changes it enough to keep looking. The ingredient list didn't make sense, until it did. The formula that appears on the Gluco6 label looked, at first glance, like a variation of something I had seen dozens of times before. A combination of botanical extracts, minerals, and amino acid derivatives that reads like a greatest hits compilation of the blood sugar supplement category. And in my experience, a formula that familiar is usually a formula that was assembled for cost efficiency rather than efficacy, so I started at the level most people skip, not the marketing claims, the research that underpins each compound. The first ingredient I looked at was Gymnema sylvester. The evidence base for Gymnema is more substantial than I expected given how casually it appears in most supplement formulas. The compound gymnemic acid has documented activity at the level of intestinal glucose absorption. It interferes with the transport pathway that moves simple sugars from the gut into circulation. The research on this is not preliminary. There are multiple controlled trials in human populations showing a measurable effect on post-meal blood glucose and on fasting levels over time. What is different about the Gluco6 formula is where it goes beyond that baseline. Sucre, the proprietary form of the prebiotic fiber component in the formula, is not a raw ingredient in the conventional sense. It is a delivery-optimized version of a compound that has documented effects on both gut microbiome composition and glucose metabolism. The distinction between a standard fiber supplement and a delivery-optimized prebiotic at the dose present in this formula is not trivial. Gut microbiome composition has documented effects on insulin sensitivity and on the speed at which glucose is absorbed from the intestinal tract. A compound that improves the microbiome environment while simultaneously providing a structural barrier to rapid glucose absorption is doing two jobs simultaneously. And that is not something most competitors in this space include. T-crine oxynolent, the other proprietary compound in the formula, addresses something the blood sugar supplement category almost universally ignores: the cognitive and energy component of blood sugar dysregulation. Chronic blood sugar imbalance produces a specific pattern of energy and cognitive disruption that is separate from the metabolic process itself. T-crine works through a pathway similar to caffeine, but without the tolerance accumulation and without the cortisol spike that makes stimulant-based energy support counterproductive for people managing metabolic health. Its presence in this formula is not cosmetic. It addresses a real symptom that the metabolic ingredients alone would not. The ingredient list did not make sense to me initially because I was reading it as a collection of familiar components. It started making sense when I understood the logic connecting them. What happens inside your body in the first 30 days? The first 30 days on Gluco6 are not what most people expect. And that disconnect is responsible for a significant portion of the negative reviews I described earlier. Here is what the research on the formula's primary mechanisms actually suggests is happening. In the first week, there is no dramatic shift. What is happening is largely invisible. The ingredients that support insulin sensitivity begin interacting with the receptors responsible for glucose uptake, but the effect at this stage is foundational rather than functional. You are not going to feel this. Your fasting numbers are not likely to move significantly in 7 days. The body does not reorganize metabolic processes on that timeline, and any supplement that tells you otherwise is either misrepresenting the research or describing a pharmacological effect, not a nutritional one. In the second and third weeks, something begins to shift at the cellular level. The compounds associated with glucose transport, and specifically the pathway that sucre is designed to support, start producing measurable effects in a subset of users. This is where some people begin noticing small but consistent changes. Fasting numbers that are marginally lower than their baseline, energy levels in the afternoon that do not collapse the way they used to, the absence of the kind of spike that typically follows a moderate carbohydrate meal. Not everyone notices this at week 2. Some people do not notice it until week 4. The variation in response time is documented in the research on the individual ingredients and is related to factors the formula cannot control: baseline metabolic function, gut microbiome composition, dietary patterns during the supplementation period, and individual receptor sensitivity. By the end of the first 30 days, the users who track their numbers consistently, not the ones who wait to feel different, but the ones who measure, typically have enough data to know whether the formula is producing a directional response in their specific metabolic environment. That data point matters more than anything subjective. It is the difference between knowing the product is working and hoping it is. The reason I am walking through this timeline in detail is not to lower your expectations. It is to give you the frame that makes the experiment meaningful. If you go into the first 30 days expecting a transformation, you will almost certainly stop before you have the data to make an informed decision. If you go in expecting a directional signal at the 30-day mark, you are setting up a test that can actually tell you something true. The FDA question. Everyone is afraid to ask. The FDA question comes up every time someone seriously considers a supplement. And the honest answer is more complicated than either side of this conversation usually makes it. Here is what the FDA actually regulates in the supplement category. The agency requires that manufacturers follow good manufacturing practices. Standards for how a product is produced, tested, and labeled. It requires that the label accurately represent what is inside the product. It requires that manufacturers report serious adverse events. What it does not do for dietary supplements is evaluate the product's efficacy before it reaches the market. That is not a loophole. That is the regulatory framework that has existed since the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was established in the mid-90s. It applies to every supplement on every shelf in every store in the country, including the ones your doctor has recommended to you. Gluco6 is manufactured in a facility that is registered with the FDA and operates under current good manufacturing practice standards. The product does not claim to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease, which is the line that would require pharmaceutical-level approval and would also fundamentally change what the product is allowed to claim and how it would be tested. What it claims falls within the category of structure and function, claims that the regulatory framework permits, and those claims carry their own evidentiary standards. I am not telling you this to provide false reassurance. I am telling you this so that your standard for evaluating this product is calibrated correctly. Asking whether Gluco6 is FDA approved in the way a drug is approved is the wrong question. Not because it is an inconvenient question, but because it applies a pharmaceutical standard to a product that operates in a different regulatory category. The right question is whether the manufacturer is operating within the standards that apply to that category. Based on what I found, the answer to that question is yes. The distinction matters because a lot of the fear around supplements is built on a regulatory misunderstanding. And a misunderstanding is not a reason to make a decision in either direction. I tried to get my money back. Here's what happened. I want to be clear about why I tested the guarantee. It was not because the product had failed to deliver what it promised. It was because a 60-day money-back guarantee is only meaningful if it actually functions. And in this category, a stated guarantee and an operational guarantee are not always the same thing. What I found when I tested the process was not what I expected based on my experience with similar products in this space. The contact process was not designed to create friction. That is the first thing I noticed. A lot of guarantee systems in the supplement category are built around delay. Slow response times, complicated return procedures, requirements that add enough steps to the process that a significant percentage of people abandon the refund before completing it. The system behind Gluco6's guarantee, accessed through the official channel, did not follow that pattern. The response time was within a window I would describe as reasonable for a consumer product. The process required documentation that was straightforward to provide, and the outcome was a refund that was processed in the time frame stated. I am not going to tell you that every refund experience with this product follows that pattern because I cannot verify every case. What I can tell you is that the guarantee is not a marketing construct with no operational reality behind it. The process exists, it functions, and it produces the outcome it promises when accessed through the correct channel, which is the official website. That distinction about the channel matters, and I will come back to it in more detail. The guarantee has terms. Those terms require that the purchase was made through the authorized source. A product purchased through a third-party reseller does not carry the same terms, regardless of what the reseller claims. If you are considering this product and the guarantee is part of your decision framework, which it should be, the channel through which you buy it determines whether the guarantee is real for you specifically. The customers who shouldn't buy Gluco6. This is the conversation that most videos in this category skip entirely. And skipping it is both a disservice to the viewer and a commercial mistake. Gluco6 is not the right product for everyone managing blood sugar. I am going to say that directly because the alternative, implying that it is universally applicable, would undermine everything else I have said in this video about approaching this product honestly. If you have type 1 diabetes, Gluco6 is not designed for your situation. Type 1 is an autoimmune condition involving the pancreas's inability to produce insulin at all. No supplement in this category addresses the mechanism driving type 1 diabetes. If you are using insulin as a replacement therapy, you are managing a fundamentally different physiological situation than the one this formula was designed to support. If you are pregnant or breastfeeding, this is not a product to be taking without explicit guidance from your physician. The research on the formula's ingredients in pregnancy is not sufficient to support a confident recommendation, and the standard of caution in that context is appropriately higher than for the general population. If you are on prescription medication for blood sugar management, metformin, sulfonylureas, GLP-1 agonists, this is a conversation that needs to happen with your doctor before you add anything to that regimen. The mechanisms through which this formula works can interact with pharmacological approaches to glucose management, and that interaction requires supervision, not self-management. And if you are someone who has blood sugar numbers that are well within normal range and is looking for a dramatic enhancement of already healthy metabolic function, this is not the product most likely to produce a meaningful result for you. The formula is designed for a specific metabolic environment, one where the pathways it targets are disrupted enough to respond to support. The reason I am being this specific about who should not buy this product is the same reason I find the rest of this investigation credible. A product that is honest about its limitations is more trustworthy on everything else it claims. What nobody tells you about the first week. The first week is where most people make the mistake that ends up in the review section. Not because the product fails, because the expectation going into that first week is almost always calibrated to a pharmaceutical timeline, not a nutritional one. And when that expectation meets a different reality, the interpretation is almost always the same. It is not working. Here's what is actually happening in those first 7 days. The formula is beginning to establish the baseline conditions that the active mechanisms need to produce a measurable effect. If you are someone who has never supplemented specifically for blood sugar support, your receptors and metabolic pathways have been operating without this kind of targeted input. The adjustment period is real, and in some people, particularly those coming from a pattern of elevated blood sugar over a long period, that adjustment can produce a temporary sense of low energy before the body recalibrates. That initial dip, when it happens, is not a warning sign. It is a sign that something is changing. The mistake is interpreting it as evidence that nothing is working. What you should actually be paying attention to in the first week is not results. It is consistency. Did you take the product at the right time relative to meals? Did you take it every day without gaps? Did you maintain the dietary baseline that makes the formula's mechanisms relevant? Meaning, you are not simultaneously eating in a way that spikes blood sugar dramatically and expecting the supplement to compensate for that pattern. The people who come back after 60 days and report meaningful changes almost universally describe the first week as unremarkable. Nothing dramatic happened. They just kept going. And that is exactly the posture the research supports, because the mechanism of action here is cumulative, not acute. Set your first measurement point at day 30, not day 7. Check your fasting numbers at day 30 against your baseline before you started. That is the first data point that is actually worth evaluating. Everything before that is noise, and treating it as signal is the most common reason people stop an experiment before they have a result. Gluco6 versus the alternatives, an uncomfortable comparison. The comparison conversation in this category is usually done one of two ways. Either someone dismisses all alternatives to position their preferred product as uniquely superior, or they construct a comparison so vague it tells you nothing useful. I am going to try to do neither. The blood sugar supplement market in the United States is large. There are products that cost less than Gluco6 per month. There are products that cost significantly more. There are products with longer ingredient lists and products with shorter ones. The question is not which product has the most impressive label. The question is which factors actually predict whether a product will produce a meaningful result in the real-world conditions most people are using it in. On price per dose, Gluco6 sits in the middle of the category. It is not the cheapest option available, and I would not pretend otherwise. But price per dose is only a meaningful comparison if the doses are roughly equivalent in their formulation logic. And in this category, they rarely are. Products that cost 30% less per month often achieve that cost reduction by using forms of their active ingredients that have lower bioavailability, meaning a smaller percentage of what you ingest actually reaches the target tissue at a meaningful concentration. The comparison that matters is cost per effective dose, not cost per capsule. On guarantee policy, Gluco6's 60-day full refund through the official channel is at the longer end of what this category typically offers. Many products in this space offer 30 days, and the process of actually executing that refund varies significantly between brands. The guarantee is only as useful as the process behind it. And what I found when I looked at this specifically is that the official channel's refund structure is documented and functional in a way that holds up to scrutiny. On the ingredient profile, what separates Gluco6 from the majority of alternatives I reviewed is not the presence of any single compound. Most of the core ingredients appear across the category in various forms. What separates it is the inclusion of sucre and T-crene, which are proprietary delivery systems rather than raw ingredients. The difference between a raw ingredient and a delivery-optimized version of that ingredient is meaningful in absorption terms, and most lower-cost alternatives do not include this layer. Gluco6 does not win every category in this comparison. It is not the cheapest. It is not the longest established name in this space. But the factors where it falls short are not the factors that predict whether a supplement will move the metabolic needle for the person using it. The factors where it leads, formulation logic, guarantee structure, sourcing transparency, are exactly those factors. The profile of people getting real results. There is a specific type of person who gets measurable results from Gluco6. Not because the formula only works for some people, but because the conditions that make any metabolic supplement effective are not universally present. Understanding that profile is more useful to you than any testimonial I could present. The first characteristic is consistency of use. This sounds obvious, but the research on how the formula's mechanisms accumulate over time makes it more specific than it seems. Missing doses consistently, particularly the first dose relative to the first meal of the day, disrupts the metabolic signaling that the formula depends on. The people who report meaningful results describe a pattern of use that is disciplined rather than convenient. They take it at the same time, in relation to the same meal trigger, every day. The second characteristic is baseline monitoring. The people who report results track their fasting blood glucose before they start the product and continue tracking at regular intervals. Not obsessively, but consistently enough to have actual data rather than subjective impression. The reason this matters is that the changes the formula produces are gradual and directional, not acute and dramatic. Someone who is not measuring will not notice a 7-point reduction in fasting glucose over 30 days. Someone who is measuring will. Those are two very different experiences of the same biological effect. The third characteristic is dietary context. Gluco6 is not a replacement for the dietary patterns that drive blood sugar management. The people who get real results are not using it as a license to eat in ways that produce dramatic glucose spikes and expecting the formula to compensate. They are using it in a dietary environment where the metabolic mechanisms it supports have something to work with. This does not mean a perfect diet. It means a dietary pattern that is not actively working against the formula's mechanisms. If those three conditions describe your situation, you are in the profile of people the evidence suggests are most likely to see a measurable result. If they do not, particularly the monitoring piece, the product may be working and you may simply not have the measurement infrastructure to know it. The real cost of doing nothing. There is a question nobody asks in this conversation, and it is the one that changes the math completely. What does it actually cost to do nothing? The answer is not zero. It never is. But in the context of blood sugar that is chronically elevated and unmanaged, the cost of inaction is one of the most expensive decisions a person can make. And it almost never feels like a decision because it does not announce itself as one. Here is what the financial picture actually looks like for someone in the United States, managing a condition in the pre-diabetic or early diabetic range without intervention. A standard panel of metabolic blood work, fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, insulin levels, runs between $100 and $300 without insurance, or involves a copay and specialist referral if you have coverage. That is not a one-time cost. That is a repeating cost as the condition progresses and monitoring frequency increases. Add the cost of a primary care consultation to interpret those results. Add the cost of the first prescription if monitoring eventually leads to a pharmacological intervention, which for the most commonly prescribed class of blood sugar management drugs runs between $30 and several $100s monthly, depending on coverage and the specific compound. add the follow-up visits required to monitor for side effects and adjust dosage. None of that math accounts for the productivity cost. The days of reduced cognitive function that come with chronic blood sugar dysregulation. The energy pattern that makes it harder to perform at work, to exercise consistently, to maintain the habits that could actually improve the underlying condition. These costs are real even when they are invisible on a balance sheet. I am not saying a supplement replaces medical care. I am saying the framing of this decision as whether you can afford to try something is built on an assumption that the alternative is free. It is not. The cost of managing a blood sugar condition that has progressed to a more serious stage is substantially higher than the cost of addressing the conditions that predict it. In the window, when those conditions are still responsive to non-pharmacological approaches, the price of a 60-day experiment with Gluco6, purchased through the official channel with a full refund available if it does not produce a meaningful result, is a fraction of a single specialist consultation in most parts of the United States. That is not a sales argument. That is arithmetic. What I would tell my skeptical self 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I was the viewer this video is for. I was looking at a supplement with a credible-sounding name, a reasonable-sounding price, and a set of claims I had heard enough variations of to be instinctively skeptical of all of them. And I would have made the same calculations most people make. Probably not worth it. Probably more of the same. Probably another $60 toward a result I could not measure. Here's what I would tell that version of myself, and what I think applies to most people in the same position. The investigation is worth doing. Not because the answer is necessarily yes, but because the alternative, dismissing something without looking at it carefully, is its own kind of mistake. The instinct that protects you from bad products also protects bad products from scrutiny. And the thing I found when I actually looked at the research, at the formulation logic, at the guarantee structure, and at the complaint landscape, is that the case for skepticism here is more specific than I expected. The concerns are real, but they are addressable. The limitations are real, but they are honest. That combination is rare enough in this category that it changes the calculation. What I would tell my skeptical self is this: the experiment is bounded. You are not committing to a belief. You are committing to 60 days of data collection, with a defined exit and a documented refund process if the data does not support continuing. That is not a purchase. That is a hypothesis test. The version of me sitting where you are right now is not being asked to believe in Gluco6. It is being asked to decide whether the cost of finding out is worth the cost of not knowing. And after everything I have looked at, my honest answer to that question has changed. The verdict: I was wrong to wait. I want to end this the way it started. Without pretending, Gluco6 is not a cure. It is not going to replace medical treatment for anyone who needs it. It is not going to work for everyone who tries it. And the results, when they come, are going to be incremental and measurable rather than dramatic and immediate. I am not revising any of that. What I am revising is the instinct that made me almost scroll past this in the first place. Because that instinct, the one that protects you from being taken advantage of in a category full of products designed to do exactly that, was not calibrated to distinguish between a product worth dismissing and a product worth testing. It was calibrated to dismiss the whole category. And that is a mistake I made for longer than I should have. The case for trying Gluco6 is not that it is perfect. It is that the bounded experiment it offers, 60 days, a documented refund process, an honest account of who it is and is not for, is the closest thing to a low-risk hypothesis test that exists in this category. And the cost of that test is a fraction of what most people in the position this product is designed for are already spending on the consequences of not addressing the underlying condition. If you are in the profile this product is designed for, elevated fasting glucose, early insulin resistance, looking for something that complements rather than replaces the other decisions you are making about your health, the link to the official channel is below. Not because you have been convinced, because you now have enough information to decide whether the experiment is worth running. The only verdict I can honestly give you is this: I was wrong to wait as long as I did to look at this carefully. The question is whether you make the same mistake.